This chapter is laid out to cover various topics, including the negotiation sessions themselves. So what happens when we're at the table, when we have the two sides, labor and management, at the table? And then we want to start talking about some other sort of universal characteristics of negotiations that I will help you in this class as well as any other class where negotiating is a large part of the activity you're responsible for. And these other elements would include information, time, and power. We want to talk about ethics and negotiation. We want to talk the idea of bargaining strategies. We want to talk about two methods, distributive or integrative bargaining, and what's the difference between those two. We want to talk about interest-based bargaining, and then we want to talk about what are the steps to, once the bargaining process is complete, about reaching agreement. And so this slide and the next couple of slides presents a model for negotiating sessions. And what this does is to kind of give us the flow of events, the scenarios that happen through a negotiating process. So in the opening session, which is this first slide, of most negotiations, time is devoted to establishing the details of the negotiation process. The parties begin with the introductions of the negotiating team members, and then they exchange lists with the names and contacts of information of members. Neither side can dictate the membership of the other side's negotiation team, but rules may be established as to how many members are allowed on each side and as to their official roles. So do they act in the capacity of the spokesperson, recording secretary, or doorkeeper, who only allows authorized persons to attend the negotiations. Negotiating teams may be kept as small as possible to allow for productive discussions. We also, during this opening statement, lay the ground rules, right? So we want to set the rules of the collective bargaining process. And obviously these rules are going to depend on whether the parties have long-standing relationships, have established procedures that can be very routine. But when the parties are new or have very poor labor relations, setting these ground rules can be difficult, although it is important since they become part of the bargaining issues. And so in the ground rules, the parties usually decide on what we call the big fives. That is, who speaks for the parties, where the parties will meet, when, that's how often and how long will they meet, how will formal proposals and responses be made, and what form of agreement will be acceptable. So the number and length of these bargaining sessions may indicate a party's reluctance to bargain in good faith. And so these and the other procedures that we talk about are often agreed to in writing as ground rules for negotiation. And then finally, a couple of examples of useful common ground rules would be something like the negotiating sessions commence on a time, date, and location which would be agreed upon by the party. The chief negotiator for the company and the chief negotiator for the union should be the chief spokesman for the respective parties' interests. However, other presence may speak as required or be called upon by the chief negotiators. If mediation is required by both parties in the case of an impasse, the mediator is someone who is agreeable to both parties. So these are ideas of the of the ground rules, or common examples of ground rules. And then we have a list of the key issues that are determined during the opening statement, and that's what is key that has to be resolved to reach a settlement. And if each party will offer up what they see as their key issues, it gives the negotiation a focus, or the negotiators a focus. And oftentimes we'll even see where these key issues are prioritized within that list, so that we can, as negotiators, we can focus on the most important, because obviously every key issue can't be the most important issue out of the list of issuances. And so now we're going to just walk through some of the the actual processes that happen. And so we have, after we've had our opening statement and we've described the big picture, both parties, we've laid our ground rules, we've gotten out on the table what our key issues are, we go into the first negotiating session, and this is where we present our proposal. So the other party presents their proposals, and during this process, as negotiators, we want to be careful to utilize these active listening tactics, so that we understand what is the other party's proposal. And then where possible, as we're listening to their proposal and as we're presenting our proposal, we want to try to, in so much as possible, identify where are the common interests, where are the areas that we already agree upon. It sets a good tone, and it also minimizes the idea of an adversarial relationship between the two parties as much as possible. And so, as we talked earlier, out of this list of key issues, we want to really negotiate the minor issues first. And in doing that, we identify the minor issues that should be easy to resolve to try to build momentum. They're minor issues. They tend to, because they are minor, because we can come to some sort of, generally some short and reasonable conclusion to them, it really sets a tone for the negotiations, and it gets the negotiations sort of off to a good start. We also include these ideas of throwaways in your list of issues to build momentum, and these are the items that you can just yield on. It shows good faith. It helps towards setting this collaborative tone. And then also we note that frequently mention that both sides need to satisfy some interest and realize mutual gains to reach an interest. Because as we can understand, the negotiators are there as representatives of their parties. For the union negotiators, they represent the union membership. As managers, we represent company management. And what we would want is a collaborative approach and something that is fair, right, and that becomes, and we'll talk about this later, sort of this integrative or win-win situation. And so negotiating these minor issues first kind of gets us a little bit closer and further along that path. And so after we've negotiated the minor issues, we really negotiate the key issues. And so when we're talking about key issues, we're really talking about items that are of economic value. And that's economic value for the union and economic value for the organization. So we start with key issues of economic value, such as wages or health care. We frame the proposals with persuasive arguments, and then we use relative norms when appropriate. And when we say relative norms, if we're talking about vacation, and so we're negotiating the number of days of vacation, a relative norm would be, well, what do other unions in similar industries offer there, or have they been able to negotiate for their union membership as numbers of days of vacation? When we talk about relative norms from a company standpoint, we might look at it the same way and say, well, how many days of vacation do our competitors offer? So, and again, we'll talk about this idea of distributive process versus integrative process. So when using a distributive process, we make the first offer to anchor the negotiation or let the other party make the first offer so that we can respond with an offer to create a favorable settlement range. And so really when we're talking about this distributive process, that's we talk about that in terms of a fixed pie, right? So the pie has to be split up between the two parties, and the more one gets, the less the other gets. And while it tends to be somewhat antagonistic because it becomes a win-lose situation, one of the strategies in this process is to set the range, and a way of setting the range is to either let the other party sort of anchor the negotiation with what their worst case is, and then we counteroffer, which creates our case, and so between their worst case and our case, we get this settlement range. Once we've gotten to the settlement range, each side should make small incremental concessions that lead to somewhere in between. We want to only make large concessions if we're matched by the other party with large concessions. Then we move into the idea of responding to proposals. We always want to take time to evaluate a proposal. We don't want to just immediately reject it because it suggests this lack of good faith. But we also want to take our time to understand it. We don't want to be in such a rush to negotiate that we don't really understand what the proposal is. When rejecting a proposal, we really want to explain why it does not work for us, whether we're the union or management. Why does it just flat out reject it without any explanation or discussion of it, again, is an illustration of bad faith. So if time is available, we should ask to suspend the negotiation to research data or information which supports our interest or questions the other party's interest or simply clarifies a fact in dispute. we want to make use of this idea of caucusing, and so that's where we essentially leave the table for an agreed to period of time, and we can to rethink, reevaluate our position in light of counter proposals or proposals by the other party. And then we want to also avoid possible impasses. And so when we talk an impasse, we're really talking about we're just not getting anywhere. We're not negotiating anything. We're just arguing and creating offers and counter offers that never get resolved. And so we really don't want to get to that point. And to the extent that these kinds of issues come up, we want to kind of table those, set them aside, and move on to the next issue to try to resolve it. And again, as we can start to build momentum, it may be that we can come back to the issue we had tabled or set aside earlier, and we'll be much closer to it than where we thought we were, and could be easier to solve. And so then we have the final stage, or the closing stage, and to facilitate that, in our ground rules, we should provide that issues agreed to during negotiations be signed off, dated, and removed from the table. So if we each got a list of 10 items, as we go down those 10 items, we should resolve that when it's solved and negotiated and finalized, it's done with, and we don't go back and visit it. Once we get a written and signed agreement or contract, it's a standard collective bargaining negotiations. One party can offer to prepare the first draft of all the signed off and agreed provisions, and then the other party proofreads it. And so we expect that many of the key issues will be settled at the end. So there are going to be a lot of issues that throughout the negotiating process we table or set aside, but we do expect that those that are key, obviously if we're tabling them and setting them aside, we're not coming to some conclusion on them, and because they're key to us, we're not willing to give on them, so we set them aside, as we said, and then when we get into the closing process, we retable them and settle them. When it appears the deal is close, we expect the other party to try a nickel and dime tactic to close the deal. And so that's just, when we do that, it's just a lot of nitpicking at items in order to close it by getting the extra half a day vacation, or the extra 15-minute break, or these little things that really don't mean anything at the end of the day, but they just continue to pile on top of one another as one party or the other tries to, what we call, nickel and dime it in order to formally close. And if we see that that's happening, we really have to be prepared to walk away rather than take a last-minute major concession just to achieve the over factor, despite how much we want to be finished with the negotiation process. And so this is really the it's kind of the process flow at a very top level, and some of the minor, or some of the tactics and strategies employed by negotiators in trying to get to some sort of agreement. And this is all in your text on figure 5.1 on page 162. And so when we're talking about ethics, and it really doesn't matter whether we're talking about ethics in business, ethics in negotiation, ethics in accounting, ethics in human resources, we're really talking about the principles and values that are ingrained in us and that become ingrained in us through a lot of different avenues. It's how our parents raised us. It's the community we lived in. It's the culture that we were raised in. It's the friends that we have. And so they really do instill principles and values in us that shape and mold our conduct and influence our behaviors. And so that's this idea of ethics. Our ethical belief system provides a basis for the values they develop, where these values reflect a person's belief about ends to be achieved and about the means for achieving desired ends. That is, these values determine what one wants to accomplish, and they determine what means one will be willing to use to reach that end. The behavioral rules are these accepted customs, standards, and models one expects of oneself in the conduct of our life and our business dealings, and really what we expect of others with whom we interact. And so in a negotiation situation, a person's ethics, values, and behavior rules are important because they influence how each party views the other, how they will evaluate the negotiation, and how they will act during the negotiation. Now, your text goes into some different ethical theories that have been used to describe alternative views of human nature, with one theory being developed by Aristotle, and that dealing with promoting a fairness or justice approach to ethics, or ethics of purpose. The second ethical theory, developed by Immanuel Kant, who was a German philosopher, that believed each person could, by reasoning, recognize that one should treat each other as he or she wished to be treated. And that kind of deals with this ethics of principle. And then the third ethical theory talked about in the text is developed by John Stuart Mills, who was an English philosopher and political economist who believed that one could only judge the moral value of an action by its end result. And that's kind of referred to as this, we've heard of this before, end justifies the means, or ethics of consequence. And so it's interesting to understand and to read about some of these different philosophical arguments around the theory of ethics. And so I do encourage you to take a little time. It's a very short section in the text. I do encourage you to take a little time and read that, just from a general knowledge standpoint and an appreciation of the different ethical theories that are involved. So we also know that when we get into ethical dilemmas, right, where we have a conflict between what we feel like is the right thing to do, but yet alternative decisions available to us, that's this idea of an ethical dilemma. And particularly with respect to labor negotiations, we talk in terms of deception, right, or misrepresenting one's position, or bluffing, or falsification. And so these are all different unethical types of behavioral activities used in bargaining tactics. And so what we have here is just really a synopsis of perceptions around what, with respect to bargaining tactics, what are ethical or appropriate tactics, and then what are marginal tactics, and then what are inappropriate or unethical tactics. So I would encourage you to read these and think about them as you read them. This is table 5.1 on page 172, and kind of think about what your thoughts are as far as how you view these particular tactics as appropriate, marginal, or inappropriate. And so collective bargaining generally involves one of two strategies, either the distributive or integrative approach. When considering which approach might be best for a given collective bargaining situation, and since neither of these is best for all situations, a negotiator should first review the issues that we talked about with respect to information, timing, and power. And then there are other significant factors to be considered, which include the specific issues to be negotiated, the people involved, and the general context of the negotiations. Of course, the specific issues are probably the most important. So we talk about this idea of, let's go on to the next slide. And so when we talk about this idea of distributive bargaining, it's really a negotiation method in which two parties strive to divide a fixed pool of resources. So think of money, right? So I don't have unlimited money. There's not unlimited money. So for you to get more money in a negotiation, I have to give up money. For me to hold on to what money I have, you have to give up the desire to get some of it. So it's talked as though we think about this as if it's a fixed pie scenario. The more pie you get, the less pie I have, right? It's also talked in terms of being a fixed sum game, and where there's only a fixed amount or a fixed sum that's got to be negotiated between the two parties. And another way is being thought of as a win-lose situation. So negotiators need to be prepared to use the distributive bargaining tactics successfully and be prepared to respond to them if the other side uses them, because for many people, this bargaining process is negotiation. When we hear the word negotiation, we typically think of things like the car buying situation, where I want the car as cheap as I can get it. The dealer wants to make as much as they can, and between those two parties, somewhere the deal has to be struck. And so we can think about distributive bargaining with respect to these 5 key elements. And so when we talk about the target point, we're talking about the most desired outcome or objective that the negotiator sets for an issue. And it is that point at which the negotiator would prefer to end the negotiation and would accept an offer. When we talk about the resistance point, it's the maximum or minimum beyond which the negotiator will not accept a proposal. So we think of the resistance point as the negotiator's bottom line. We talk about the initial offer, so that's the first number or offer the negotiator presents as a written formal proposal, and it's accepted as a reasonable starting point for the other side. We talk about this idea of a settlement range, and here it's the difference between the resistance points of management and labor is the range in which actual bargaining occurs, because anything outside the range would be rejected by one or the other party. And then finally we talk about the settlement point, and that's the heart of negotiations. It's the process of reaching agreement on one point within the settlement range, that is this settlement point. The objective of each party is to achieve a settlement point as close to its possible target point as possible. And so when we're negotiating an issue of economic or numeric value, right, one very useful negotiating tactic is for the negotiator to decide on these three key starting points or values. The target point, right, which is the most desired outcome, or simply where you want to end up. That's your settlement point, right? The resistance point or bottom line, that's the absolute maximum or minimum value you would accept, beyond which you'd walk away. And then the initial offer, or the opening offer, which when put on the table with justification is viewed by the other side as the true first number and not as a low ball or a high ball offer. And so it really sets, if we think about the offer, opening offer, and it's deemed to be a legitimate initial offer, then that really sets the one end of the settlement range, right? And so when we talk about this, for example, in a wage negotiation, the union negotiating team decided that it could not sell any wage cuts to the members, and so just a wage increase of 0 was their bottom line, right? They would not get their union membership to agree to a cut, so the best they could get would be a 0 increase, because that's no increase, but it's also no cut. At the same time, they decided an increase of 2% was the highest they could reasonably expect to achieve, and therefore that became their desired outcome. So the union chose 4.5% at their opening offer because it was the highest wage increase they could find a similar union had negotiated, and so they could defend it. Thus, the key three values in this situation that we talked about was the 0, 2, and 4.5. And so this figure 5.2 illustrates an example of the distributive bargaining process. Both sides develop and keep confidential their target and resistance points, and labor has surveyed its members and they've reviewed similar contracts recently negotiated and estimated that the company's financial situation. Within a generally favorable economic climate, the labor negotiators set 4.5% as their wage rate target, but are willing to consider any offer above 3%, which is referred to as the resistance point. If the total package contains other benefits, they honestly believe that the members would vote against any contract with less than a 3% increase because of inflation, since the last negotiation has averaged 4%, and recent contracts in the industry have included raises between 3 and 5%. However, on the other side, management negotiators set their target point at 3%. So that's the lowest increase negotiated by any of their competitors. The company president has authorized negotiators to accept an offer of up to 5%, which is the management's resistance point if the total economic package is within a certain dollar amount. So then both sides choose their initial offer. Management decides that a proposed wage giveback, that's a decrease in base wage, might be considered bad faith because the company is in reasonably good financial condition, so it initially offers a 0% increase, which is the lowest possible given the circumstances. Labor knows that no similar union has received more than 6% and therefore feels that 9.5%, just under the double digits, is a high and initial offer and could be within the context of good faith bargaining. Both sides realize that their initial offers must be different from their target point to allow room for negotiation or the give and take, while also staying within what the other side would consider a reasonable offer and good faith offer. And at the same time, both sides realize that the other side's initial offer has left them room to negotiate and it's not their last, best, or final. So now we have negotiators between the two sides that center on 0 to 9.5% range, and each side begins to convince the other to move from its initial offer. Neither side really knows the target or resistance point of the others, but both sides will, through bargaining and table discussions, begin to estimate the target and resistance points of the other side to determine if the settlement range exists, and therefore a settlement point can be found. The settlement point is finally reached when one side achieves the target point, or when both sides are willing to accept something less than their target points but within the settlement range. And so we know that negotiations seldom take place in a vacuum, but are often guided by these ideas of social norms or accepted practice that are based on the context of the situation. And that's what a norm is, right? So we have workplace norms, we have social norms, we have all different types of norms based on the particular context in which that behavior is manifest. 4 common negotiation norms that influence negotiators' behaviors include relational norms, fairness norms, reciprocity, and good faith norms. So a relational norm is really where both parties involved are in a pure exchange relationship in which, like you think about it, such as a one-time car purchase where there's no prior purchase or relationship and no future car or no future purchase is expected. So it's really a transactional type of relationship. This transactional type relationship is generally not the case when we're in labor relations, because we're really working with perhaps people we know, perhaps people we've worked with outside of the negotiation, perhaps we know their families, right? Perhaps they know our families. And so there is this sort of a relationship that exists, and the critical relationship creates a cycle that starts with a high level of trust, and it causes both sides to consider an expanded scope of possibilities to settle thorny issues. The high trust relational norm is critical to successful win-win bargaining processes, and any violation of that trust can usually lead to a very difficult win-lose behavior. The desire is referred to a relational norm, and it can easily cause tension between a negotiator's desire to maximize outcome and a desire to maintain a positive relationships. Relational norms can cause negotiators to overlook maximum outcomes in favor of suboptimal or less efficient trades that are considered important in providing more positive long-term relationships. The next one we have is this idea of fairness norms. So negotiations of all types provide many situations in which people seek consistency owing to the high level of uncertainty. The use of a norm to provide consistency in a bargaining situation can give a negotiator what is called a normative leverage. Right? And so this negotiation process involves one of our human nature's most basic psychological drives, and that's the need to maintain an appearance of consistency and fairness in words and deeds. And psychologists call this need to appear reasonable the consistency principle. And so in order to illustrate this fairness norms, right, or in order to be perceived, we believe for us to be perceived as being fair, we'll really draw on 4 other major norms, and that's the equality norm, where we often call it a 50-50 or split the difference, where we're just trying to be equally or portray some equality. Then we call the equity norm, or this distribution, which is based on proportional inputs of the parties. We have this need norm, and that can be a powerful social norm. So, for example, a union may stress the need for their members to receive a pay increase that equals recent increases in cost of living to maintain their living standard, or we call this the maintaining the status quo norm, or keeping all significant losses in their current state. And so this fairness norm of maintaining the status quo is often employed by labor negotiators and arbitrators. So then we also have this idea of reciprocity norm. The tendency to respond to the actions of others with equal or similar actions is the source of the reciprocity norm. Some people think that it's this eye for an eye, and that's the most reasonable response to another party. They're practicing the reciprocity norm. In social relationships such as negotiations, people are often governed by rules of reciprocity, meaning that they seek to minimize the difference between the benefits they provide others and the benefits received from others. The underlying cause of this norm is a person's sense of obligation, whereby people often feel a strong need to respond in kind when they are given something of value from someone else. And then finally, we have this good faith bargaining norm. And so in labor negotiations, good faith bargaining is mandated as part of the collective bargaining process by the National Labor Relations Act. The Act requires the representatives of labor and management to meet at reasonable times and to confer in good faith on wages, benefits, hours, and working conditions. So, however, it does not require either party to make a concession or agree to a proposal. The good faith bargaining norm is, however, a part of both negotiations. And so here we just show it's a brief discussion of each of these norms again. So we talked about the relational norm, the fairness norm, the reciprocity norm, and the good faith bargaining norm. And what this figure does is to provide us with sort of a summarization of the discussion of each of those norms. And so now we talk about this idea of framing positions. How do we present our proposal or our counter proposal? This presentation is essentially, part of that is essentially framing. And so framing is defined as, it is a key tactic in the negotiation process. And what happens is that when we frame an issue, we use by framing this, we're using some of the norms or other justifications to support a certain position that is designed exactly how the issue will be presented to the other side in a context that is convincing. And so when we talk about framing, we define it as presenting an issue to the other side in negotiation in a way that is convincing and causes the other side to see the proposal in a different light. The framing of an issue can greatly affect the outcome of an issue. Even a one-word change can significantly alter how both sides view the issue. So, for example, in negotiations between two unions to merge, the union employees of two organizations, the parties were reviewing the list of people. In some cases, only one person could be retained at the salary and position now held by two. In the case of one position, a negotiator stated, "Now thinking about Taylor, he is too valuable not to keep in the foreman job." The second negotiator, who wanted his own person in that position, needed to quickly reframe the issue of Taylor and repeated the statement with a one-word insertion. "In thinking about Taylor, he thinks he is too valuable not to keep him as the foreman." And so, this idea of reframing the issue of Taylor's worth in a new organization was totally changed from fact, that is, the assertion that the first statement presented, to one of the lofty opinion that Taylor had of himself. And so that's this whole idea of framing. And so there are really 4 different types of frames that we can consider using when presenting a proposal, and they are described here in Table 5.2. We can talk about reframing, which is the use of unifying, open-ended, and problem-solving suggestions starting with a what if or how, right? We can talk about it in terms of a focus frame, where we are changing the context from a cost decision by focusing on the uniqueness of whatever the issue is. We talk about a contrasting frame, where we change management's context from a single payment, right, to something that's much, this is an idea or an example where it's much, a much smaller monthly amount. Or we talk about this idea of a negative frame, where we're trying to change management's context from winning to avoiding a loss. And obviously these can be turned around and be talked of from the management's perspective about how we use one of these types of frames to change the union context in similar ways. So Negotiators can use framing statements when we talked about or they can use framing questions to change the context of an offer made by the other party. Right? And so, when we're using framing context, we ask why. So instead of treating the opponent's offer as an adversarial position, use it as an opportunity to better understand his or her interest to test the firmness of the position. We can also ask why not. So if the opponent will not reveal the source of his or her positioning, ask why not can help uncover the real interest of the other party. We ask what if, so and instead of disagreeing with the other offer of the other party, we acknowledge it and respond with an option. And then we ask for advice. And so that's if we ask for it in a constructive manner, the other party may develop an option themselves that represents a positive movement towards settlement. And so effective questioning and listening to responses in the use of framing questions is a critical negotiation skill. If negotiators spend more time arguing their positions and defending their stance on issues than they do asking questions, they cannot gain important insights into the implicit needs and concerns of the other party, and thus we cannot respond with proposals that are likely to get us to a settlement. And so integrative bargaining was the second approach to bargaining that we talked about. And like the distributive technique, it's largely developed within the field of collective bargaining and labor negotiations. It's evolved today into a popular alternative to distributive bargaining. Remember, distributive bargaining being fixed pie. What you give up, I get. What I get, you're giving up, and vice versa. It's fixed. Right? Integrative bargaining is a more cooperative approach to negotiation or conflict resolution, and we think about it in terms of win-win or mutual gains or an interest-based approach. Right? So integrative bargaining can be broadly defined as a negotiating process in which the parties strive to integrate their interests as effectively as possible into the final agreement. Through integrative bargaining, we strive to achieve two goals that include to create as much value as possible for both sides and to claim as much value as possible for each of our own interests. And so it does not require parties to create, integrative bargaining does require parties to seek out creative options and not simply focus on trading concessions on interest. It generally requires the existence of several issues to be negotiated, which enables the negotiators to find common grounds on some issues, trade off positions on some issues, and claim value on some issues. To create value and discover mutual benefits or common ground on some issues does require that the parties share information and present more options than is typically thought about in distributive bargaining. And so in this table, we think again about distributive bargaining in terms of win-lose or fixed pie, and we think about integrative bargaining as common interest and win-win. We can see some of the differences in this table 5.3, which is on page 187 of your text. We can see some of the common differences between these two different approaches with respect to the different factors down the left-hand side of the page. And so this idea of principled negotiation is really was developed by Roger Fisher and William Urey in their landmark book, Getting to Yes. And they discuss these four components of integrated, or as we've also called it, interest-based bargaining. And they get to this with a strategy that they call principled negotiation that has these four components. It's you emphasize positions versus interest, right? We separate people from issues, so it reduces this idea of personalization. We focus on objective criteria, and then we develop mutual gains and options. They explain that most traditional negotiators use the distributive model of negotiating, or a strategy of distributive bargaining, in which each side makes an offer, determines their resistance point, guesses the resistance point of the other side, and then begins to haggle over the resistance points, or what that perceived difference is. Each side gives reasons why their position is the best and offers to make small concessions until an agreement is made. The entire negotiation process is about each negotiator presenting and defending his or her position, and often negotiators in defending their positions tend to get emotionally involved and locked into the arbitrary positions. These more negotiations focus on positions, the less they discuss what they're really interested in. And so table 5.4 on page 189 gives us an example of this difference between positions versus interest. And if we look at this with respect to a union, and so we look at it with management, we say the management's position on this particular issue was that we want to change the work assignment clause of the contract and we want to maintain management risk. The union's position on the same issue is that the work assignment clause was a gain in a prior negotiation, so giving that up now would be losing. Their real interest, if we look behind these positions, is that management really, their interest was to reduce overtime costs. The union's interest was to keep employees from being disciplined for failing to perform in temporary work assignments. And so in looking at this, we can see that a position really is a specific demand that a party has chosen, while their interest really includes the underlying needs or desires, concerns, and fears that cause the party to choose the position. Principled negotiations involve revealing and reconciling the interest rather than simply defending and exchanging positions on interest in the terms of that we talked about or just talked about with respect to distributive bargaining. And so it works because in most cases several positions exist that may satisfy an interest. So if we can address the interest, we may be able to work through a lot of positions simultaneously. And so this just illustrates up for us the steps that are in the in the bargaining, the interest-based or integrated bargaining negotiation process. We start with step 1, where the parties begin by exchanging information and seeking to identify the issues to be negotiated, listening to them or listing them, and then each side explaining their interest on these issues. And here, the key steps in this first step are ideas like using active listening, right, where we understand and listen closely to the other party's explanation without interrupting, not disputing facts or beliefs or objecting to the statement even if it's critical of our position on the issue. We also use open-ended questions about the level of need, interest, or concern on the other party for each issue. And then we also express empathy for the other party's feelings using reflective statements. The second step is this categorization method of interest-based bargaining negotiations, and that generally begins with the parties developing a common list of all issues of possible interest that were discussed by either side during the first step. Then the third step, again, involves this idea of listening, discussing, and reaching final agreement on the compatible issues and removing them from further negotiation. Then the fourth step, which involves the trade-off of issues, which is really the heart of the integrative process. Both parties review the list of issues identified in the first step with the compatible issues removed in the second step, and that leaves the remaining unresolved issues that need to be resolved through the exchange of one issue for another. And then finally, in the fifth step, it's the resolution of the final issues, and that's often that phase, the fifth step, is often accomplished through distributive bargaining. However, because the prior steps have resolved most of the issues, both parties are less likely to walk away from the table over the last issue. And so if we apply the 5 steps of the categorization interest-based approach that we just presented to labor management contract negotiations. And so you can see that the advantages of the interest-based bargaining compared with traditional methods include that by focusing on interest and not stating positions, the negotiators will have improved communication and are more likely to fully understand the underlying interests of the other party, which allows them to do their work in joint open sessions. And also, the joint development of options through the brainstorming is more likely to uncover additional ideas and perhaps yield superior solutions to problems. The traditional method that focus on defending stated positions are more likely to break down because the parties are too vested in their positions instead of trying to uncover new options. This focus, also the focus on interest, is more likely to cause the parties to explain the critical why behind the interest or the proposal. Along with these advantages come certain disadvantages, and so it may be that the method used requires a great deal of time discussing interest and possible options when a mutual solution could be reached just as quickly by using the more traditional methods. The IBB negotiators may have difficulty transferring a proposed creative option into a practical, concrete solution. And then finally, the standards suggested by the IBB negotiators often aren't precise and are subjective, and so they are not easily agreed to by both parties. And so, although several of the negotiation processes that we can describe as integrated, the categorization method is one that can be easily learned. Once the categorization method is understood, we can build on and expand the basic interest-based method into more robust interest-based method. So there are 5 steps in the categorization method of integrated or win-win bargaining. And we present these steps here, where they include steps like exchanging information, right? Developing a common list of issues, agreeing on compatible issues, exchanging equal value issues, and resolving remaining issues using distributive bargaining. And what you can see is that, it's really the exchange of information is kind of uniform in each method across the board, right? But what we're doing is, by developing a common list, agreeing on a compatible list, exchanging equal value issues, we're really categorizing, right, our issues into certain buckets, whether it's common or compatible or equal value, and then what's left over are the remaining issues. And we're working toward fully resolving each bucket or each category of issue. And we do that using the same types of skills that we used and talked about earlier. And that's, active listening, open-ended questions, reflective statements, asserting our own needs, refraining from making personal attacks. So all of those are kind of best practices across whichever method we choose to use. And this figure 5.7, which is on page 191, just really simply gives us the steps, right? The 5 steps of the categorization method of the integrated or win-win bargaining. So keep in mind, categorization method is just one method inherent to the integrative approach or win-win bargaining approach. Okay, and so after all this, finally, the negotiators reach a decision. Once all the proposals and counter-proposals have been presented and both sides believe they can't give any more, the parties reach an agreement or they stop talking. If the agreement can't be reached, this is what we refer to as the point of crisis. And then there are various techniques that involve neutral third parties, such as mediation and arbitration, that are available that bring the parties back to agreement. Job actions such as strikes and lockouts can also be utilized. Although they achieve a great deal of publicity, they are seldomly used to resolve contract disputes. And so then, knowing that an agreement has been reached, the people involved become psychologically committed to the agreement and are often eager to move quickly to sign the papers, shake hands, exchange, and so on. They're unlikely to. It's very likely that additional concessions will be made after the parties think they're done, right? And so if there are any last-minute concessions are requested, though, right? So during this phase, we think about them. We have 3 certain different responses that we could think about. One is silence, right? So, just say nothing so that we don't portray any sign of weakness. We walk away, so we may be able to project a personal indifference to settling that will concern the opposing side that has certainly become vested in reaching an agreement, or we may reciprocate, and this response technique involves inducing the other party to change a position by indicating that if he or she will change his or her position on an issue, you'll reciprocate and make another equal concession. But there is this idea of at the closing stage of these last-minute concessions coming up. And so this covers the negotiation models, strategies, and tactics. It's an interesting chapter, and it provides a lot of best practices and helpful, useful tips to use in really any negotiation process. We're talking about it in terms of labor management relations, but they really are helpful, useful ways of thinking about an approach to and a methodology of working through any negotiation on anything. It could be your paycheck or the job offer that you're waiting to get. So please read the chapter, and then don't hesitate to contact the facilitator with any questions or concerns. And